And can you guys see the screen? So today we'll have our second last session. So this is live session 12. We'll have one more session on 18th of October, which is this Friday. So today we'll complete the first half of the revision of the course. And on 13th, we'll complete the second half. And if you guys want, we can discuss some assignment questions on next Friday. Or if you guys have any specific doubts or any specific questions that you find are slightly more difficult for you to solve, we can talk about that on 18th. We can also talk about that today if you guys have any questions, because yeah, this is like the end of the course. So it's mostly revising whatever was taught before. If you have any issues with any concept, or if you have any issues with any of the questions or any other things, we can discuss that today and Friday. Okay. So we'll start with the revision. So first we'll talk about what we learned in week 1, which was introduction. So basically we talked about the basics of ecology. What is ecology? Ecology is basically oikos. It comes from the root words oikos and logos. Oikos means home and logos means study. So ecology is the scientific study of basically the study of home. So we have two definitions that we talked about. First is ecology is the scientific study of interactions among organisms and their environment. And the second is it's the scientific study of interactions that determine the distribution and abundance of organisms. Right. Then we talked about why do we study ecology. So basically to know more about, what do we study in ecology? So basically we study the habitat, which is the natural place where an animal lives. We talked about biodiversity, where different species found in a given area, what is the distribution and abundance of a given species, right? We talked about population interactions, which is basically interaction between organisms of the same population or species. So what is this male-male competition, group living, and all those things? We talked about, yeah, we can also talk about community interactions, which is basically interaction between different species in a given area. So basically predator-prey relationships or pollinator plant relationships and things like that. Then we also study in ecology what are the effects of changes such as climate change and desertification. How does it affect our environment and how we can prevent that? Right. So there are three main approaches that we take when we are studying ecology. So the first is theoretical approach, where we are basically using equations and models to explain empirical observations. So this is, for example, an example of this would be the Lotka-Volterra models, which basically determine the abundance of predator and prey at any given point of time. Then we have the laboratory approach, where we are basically using the lab and formulating and testing hypotheses via experiments. So this is basically like doing a study in a lab. So basically, if you want to know what is the temperature range that a certain species of, let's say, a gecko can survive through, so you bring it to the lab and you basically increase the temperature, decrease the temperature, and you manipulate all those kinds of things. And you note what is the response when is the gecko starting to feel like it's not able to cope up, and yeah, what is the critical temperature, what is the temperature above which they can't survive, and all that. So you can do all those kinds of things using a laboratory approach. And finally, we have the field approach, where we basically go to the field and make observations. And here, based on our observations, we try to build theories. Right. So next, we talked about a historical overview of ecology, where we talked about a few prominent people. So first was Theophrastus, who was a student of Aristotle, and he's considered the father of botany. He described the interrelationships between animals and the environment. So basically, he connected the biotic and abiotic components of environment together. Uh, he basically had this uh, collection of 10 books, uh, which is called Inquiry into Plants. So basically, where he basically classified plants according to a lot of different characters and discusses the importance of soil and climate to plants. Then we have Carlos Linnaeus, as most of you would know. He's a Swedish botanist who is considered the father of modern taxonomy, and he created a system of naming and classifying species. So the binomial nomenclature that we have, that is genus versus genus and species, such as Homo sapiens or Panthera tigris and all that, that was devised by Carlos Linnaeus. He basically with these broad classifications or stages. So basically, uh, from kingdom, you move to phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, and you basically group species that are similar together into a similar genus. For example, tiger, lion, and all those would be grouped together into the same genus, right? Which is Panthera. Okay. Then it goes into the same family. So many genus that are similar go to the same family, and so on till you approach the kingdom. Right. Next, we have Thomas Robert Malthus. He basically wrote this famous essay on the principle of population, where he basically predicted that population growth is geometric, up geometric progression and exponential, whereas the food that we get is increasing at uh, rate of arithmetic progression. So it's not geometric. And thus he says that there's a limit to which population can grow and basically all those things. And his work influenced a lot of studies in population ecology. Next, we have Alexander von Humboldt, who is considered the father of biogeography. He performed a lot of quantitative work on botanical geography. Then we have Alfred Russel Wallace, uh, and along with Charles Darwin, he conceived the theory of evolution through natural selection independently, and both of them basically published it parallelly. He also worked on biogeography, and the Wallace line separates animals of Asian origin from animals of Australasian origin is basically given by him. Right? Darwin, we all know, gave the theory of evolution and the theory of natural selection. Then we have Herbert Spencer, who is best known for his expression survival of the fittest, which fits into Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Then we have Ernest Haeckel, who coined the term ecology, and he had made a lot of detailed multiple illustrations of animals and sea creatures. And he's well known as a very good professor, physician, and marine biologist. Next, we have Vladimir Vernadsky, who basically was one of the first scientists to recognize that uh, biogeochemical cycles are going on. So basically, the oxygen, the nitrogen, and the carbon dioxide that is present in the atmosphere, that is present in the biotic components of the environment, are basically getting cycled and basically getting converted from inorganic to organic forms and then back again to inorganic forms. Right. Then we have Arthur Ransley, who introduced the concept of ecosystem into biology, and he also founded the British Ecological Society. We have George Evelyn Hutchinson, who basically gave the theory of interspecific competition and treatise on limnology, which is basically study of inland aquatic systems. He is considered a father of modern ecology. We have Charles Sutherland Elton, who basically was a pioneer of modern population and community ecology, and he pioneered studies of invasive organisms, and he is known as the father of animal ecology. Next, we have Asher James Lotka and Vito Volterra, who together gave the Lotka-Volterra equations for predator-prey relationship. Next, we have Eugene P. Odom, who basically is known for his book Fundamentals of Ecology, published in 1993. Next, we got to know a bit more about evolution. So basically ecology, as we talked about, is the scientific study of interaction among organisms and the environment, whereas evolution is the genetic adaptation of organisms to their environment. Right. So ecology is basically how they are interacting in present. Evolution is more like how they are getting adapted to the environment, how they are changing in response to the environment. Right. Adaptation is basically any alteration or in the structure or function of an organism by which the organism becomes better able to survive in a given environment. Right. It can be genetic. Genetic basically means that it relates to genes. Genetic adaptation is basically a inheritable fitness. So basically something that makes you fit and that is inheritable. So if you have it, your son or daughter or yeah, grandchildren have it. Yeah. We talked about examples of adaptation such as camels. Uh, Basically, they have multiple adaptations to survive in deserts, such as the hump, fatted legs, concentrated urine, and large eyelashes. We talked about fitness, which is basically defined as the ability of a particular organism to leave descendants in future generation relative to other organisms. So basically, how many descendants are you leaving with relation to other organisms? Right. Evolution acts to maximize fitness through natural selection. That is basically the theory of evolution. Uh, and there's a lot of different characteristics of fitness. So fitness is environment specific. A camel is fit in a desert. It will never be fit in the sea. Right. Like you won't consider that fit in the sea. Fitness is species specific. So if you change the species, the fitness also changes. The like high reproductive rate does not mean fitness, but survival of progeny is what matters. So even if you make 100 children, you need to ensure that at least more than half of them survive for you to have a very high fitness rate. Uh, and fitness is measured across generations. It's a long-term measure. It's not a short-term measure that can be done in a single generation as well. And it works at the level of a complete organism, not on individual traits such as size or speed. Right. Then we talked about natural selection, which is basically the process by which organisms best adapted to the environment tend to survive and transmit their genetic characteristics to succeeding generations, while those that are less adapted tend to be eliminated. We talked about the five steps in natural selection. So variation where we basically have some kind of variation in the genes or the alleles or things that are basically expressed. So we have some variation in the population. For example, in the pepper moth case study, we have some variation. Some moths are white, some moths are black. Right. Then the next thing we have is overpopulation. So overpopulation in this case is basically the females lay around 2000 eggs at a time, but they don't have enough resources for all the 2000 eggs to hatch and basically grow. So what happens is there's a lot of competition, there's a lot of overcrowding, a lot of overpopulation. This leads to a struggle for existence, which is basically that predation is also another thing that adds to the struggle for existence. Already there are like not a lot of resources, and now these different birds or other animals that are basically eating these birds. Right. So the next thing is survival of the fittest. So basically, in an unpolluted environment where we have lichens growing on trees, the tree barks are white, and that's why it's very difficult to see these white peppered moths, but it's very easy to see these black peppered moths. Whereas in a polluted environment where the tree bark is coated with like soot or carbon, in that case, it gets much easier to see the white peppered moths instead of the black ones. So in the first case, the fitter one would be the whiter white pepper moth because it's getting uh, camouflage into the surroundings and you can't basically other predators can't basically see it and eat it. Whereas in the polluted environment, the darker moths are more fit. Right. So survival of the fittest is the next thing that happens. And basically, eventually, it leads to changes in the gene pool. So over time, we see that as there was industrialization and the trees barks became darker and darker for more years, what happened was the population of dark pepper moths started increasing and the population of white pepper moths started decreasing. So there were changes in the gene pool. because of all these natural selection, all this selection. There are three kinds of selection. One is directional selection, where you basically move into one direction. So this dotted line is the original population. The solid line is the population after selection. So basically, your trait is going towards one extreme, either it's to the left or to the right. Right. The next thing is stabilizing selection, where you basically have a higher center and your uh, edges are, or both extremes are getting eliminated more and more. So your population was initially like this and it became like this. It was initially like this and then it became like this, right? And disruptive selection is when the middle part is not being selected against, and therefore you have two peaks, on either side of the middle part. Right? Then we talked about some examples of direction selection, such as Galapagos. Galapagos finches beak size after drought. How basically it change, how the beak depth change because drought meant that only hardy nuts are surviving, and it became more difficult for them to basically survive on hardy nuts if they had smaller beaks. Right. For stabilizing selection, we talked about the number of robin eggs. If there are like more eggs, then the chicks will be malnourished and they won't be able to survive. If there are less eggs, and by chance some of them might die and they won't be able to survive. Therefore, ideally, an ideal number of eggs that a robin lays is somewhere around 4 to 5. Next, we talked about disruptive selection, where we talked about the African solitary and its wing coloration. So basically, mm, here basically due to mimicry, the species is basically having disruptive selection where they're basically selecting for two different moths, which are basically mimics of two different unpalatable species. Right. Then we talked about co-evolution, where basically, which is basically the evolution of two or more species that interact closely with one another, uh, and in a way that like each species is adapting to changes in the other species. Right. So some examples would be like cheetah and impala, if like because cheetahs are like faster, they can run fast in straight lines. Impalas have evolved to be more agile, so they can change their direction quite easily. Right. Then zebras have basically evolved to basically hide because of their stripe pattern. Right. Then again, like there's always like this co-evolution between predator and prey in any system that keeps on going, and also between host and parasite that keeps on going. The host tries to find a way to eliminate the parasite, but the parasite is like, I'll find another way to get what I want, and so on. It goes on. Similarly, with the predator and prey, the same thing happens. Uh, then in the next week, we talked about the levels of organization. Does anyone have any questions till now? Okay. In the next week, we talked about the levels of organization, where we basically talked about the parable of the two watchmakers, and we learned why hierarchy is important, why hierarchical uh, things are more stable. Hierarchical things are basically more stable, and that's why they are chosen evolutionarily. So Simon says that hierarchy emerges almost inevitably through a wide variety of evolutionary processes for the simple reason that hierarchical structures are stable. So, for example, these centipede segments and other things are examples of hierarchical structure because it's just one small structure repeated over and over again. Right. Then we talked about the emergent principle, which is also something that is related to hierarchical principles. Basically, once you have these assemblies and sub-assemblies, you have some things that are emerging which were not there before. So the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and the whole has properties that the parts don't have. So, for example, these five ants, they can float even when one ant will drown in water. If they make a ball, they like if they form a raft, which is basically by biting the legs of each other, they can basically make this raft where they can float and they can survive. Fire ants have Fire ant rafts have altered hydrophobicity. They are more hydrophobic and they repel more water compared to individual fire ants. Then they have other properties that are not found in individual ants, such as elasticity and viscosity. Uh, right. So you don't have these properties in ants, but you have these properties in rafts, which is like emerging because a lot of these ants are coming together to build these ants. We talked about different levels of organization, which is like the subcellular organelle, which is basically a specialized subunit in the cell, which performs a specific function. We have cell, which is the basic structural, functional, and biological unit of all living organisms. We have tissue, which is an ensemble of similar cells that are of the same origin and carry out a specific function. Then organs, which are a collection of tissues that have similar functions. Organ system is a collection of organs with that perform one or more large functions. Organisms are basically entities that exhibit properties of life and basically individual entities. We have population, which is a group of individuals from the same geographical area that have the capability of interbreeding. Interbreeding is basically they can breed and produce fertile offspring within themselves. Next, we have community, which is basically a association of populations of two or more different species. So population is basically a single species. A community is basically two or more species in a particular geographical area at a particular time. Then we have ecosystem, which is basically uh, a community that is made up of all the living organisms, along with the non-living, the abiotic components such as air, water, and soil. Next, we have biome. So biome is basically what do you say? Similar kind of environment, similar kind of ecosystem across the world. Right. For example, desert is a biome. A desert is there are different kinds of the different deserts that are found across the world, but the desert is a biome. So all the plants and animals that are living in these deserts, even across the world, have similar kind of adaptations because of the conditions that are similar. Biosphere is basically the worldwide sum of all the ecosystems, and it's the portion of Earth that supports life. Next, we talked about species abundance and composition. We talked about what you see in a jungle, all the different kinds of organisms. Then we talked about what is biodiversity. Biodiversity is a variety of life in all its forms and at all levels of organization. All its forms basically means plants, vertebrates, invertebrates, fungi, bacteria, other microbes, everything, animals. And at all levels of organization means the diversity of um, genes, species, and ecosystems. So basically, species biodiversity is basically uh, how many species are there and how they are distributed. Species are basically actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations, which are reproductive isolated from other species, other such group, right? Species biodiversity basically gives us the idea of how many species are there and how they are distributed in a given area. Genetic biodiversity is basically the diversity of genetic information that is present at different levels, such as phyla, family, species, population, and individuals. So, how different is the gene of this individual compared to another of the same species? Or how different is the genetic information in the present in the different individuals of the same population, and so on? Right. A gene is basically a unit of heredity that is transmitted from parents to offspring. Next, we talked about polymorphism, which is basically the proportion of or percentage of genes that are polymorphic. Polymorphic gene is basically gene is considered polymorphic if the frequency of the most common allele is less than 95%. Right. If it's more than 95%, then it's considered to be monomorphic, which has one form. But if it has more than one forms, it is considered polymorphic. Heterozygosity is basically the proportion of genes at which the average individual is heterozygous. We learned about how we make these calculations. We talked about ecosystem biodiversity, where basically we are looking So ecosystem is basically a group of interacting organisms and the physical environment they inhabit. Ecosystem biodiversity basically asks what different kinds of ecosystems are there and how they are distributed, because both of these things are important for us. Next, we talked about how do we measure biodiversity. So the two things that we measure are species richness and species evenness. Richness is basically the number of species present. Evenness is basically the distribution of individuals of different species. How many individuals belong to which species? Right. We can plot a species accumulation curve to figure out how many species are there in a given area. So if you go and sample more and more, eventually you will see that initially you might find newer species every day or every week, but after some time you'll see that it gets really difficult to find a new species, and that time you see that the curve is getting saturated, and therefore maybe around these many species are present in that area. We learned about Simpson's diversity index, which basically, based on the proportion of the species, it gives you what is the diversity of a given area. And equitability or evenness is basically this value divided by the maximum value that you can get. So the maximum value is when each species is represented by only one individual. Great. Next, we have Shannon's diversity index, which uses a proportion of ith species and the log proportion of ith species to calculate the diversity, to calculate an index, which basically gives you the diversity value of a given area. This also again can be converted into the equitability index by dividing it with the maximum value. The maximum possible value of Shannon's index is given by log S. S is basically the number of species in the area. Right. Next, we talked about what are the different measures of biodiversity: alpha biodiversity, beta biodiversity, and gamma biodiversity. Alpha biodiversity is something that exists within an ecosystem. Beta is diversity that exists among different ecosystems, and gamma biodiversity is diversity that exists among different geographies, so in a much larger area. Next, we have biodiversity hotspots, which are basically areas with high species richness, high degree of endemism, and high degrees of threat. We have these global biodiversity hotspots that are present all across the world. Mm, Then the question arises, why do some areas have more diversity and some areas have less? You see that most of the diversity of, let's say, birds, mammals, or any other species that you take is mostly concentrated around the equator and not so much around the poles. So why do some areas have more high biodiversity and some have less? We talked about different hypotheses. The evolutionary speed hypothesis, which says that uh, there's more diversity in areas which have more time to evolve and which have more rapid evolution. And we had the geographical area hypothesis, where basically it says that there's more biodiversity in areas with larger area because they can have more biologically complex habitats and have more and can support more niches for the organisms. And niche is the position and role that an organism plays in the ecosystem. Right. And then the next one is interspecific interaction hypothesis, where basically we say that competition and predation also affect biodiversity. Competition affects niche partitioning, and basically predation retards competitive exclusion in different kinds of between different kinds of things. Then we talked about ambient energy hypothesis, which is basically that areas which have more energy or more sunlight, for example, the equators, uh, are more likely to have more biodiversity, because fewer species can tolerate very unfavorable conditions. Fewer species can live in the poles, but many more species can live in the hospitable climates near the equator, right, or somewhere in between. Then the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, where basically they say that very high or frequent disturbance leads to extinction of species. Very low or infrequent disturbance leads to competitive equilibrium and like loss of species with low competitive ability. So if there is some disturbance that is going on in a medium phase, So every few years, let's say you're going and cutting some trees, somewhere a few trees somewhere, and then every few years you go and do that. That allows for more newer species to also thrive by also letting most of the things that were present before survive. So basically that adds more biodiversity. So intermediate disturbance leads to higher biodiversity compared to very high or very low, very infrequent or very frequent disturbances. And we talked about how do we calculate the economic value of biodiversity. We have two kinds of value: use value, which is the value arising out of the use of our resource; non-use value, which is the value arising even though our resource is not being used. So again, use value is divided into direct value, indirect value, option value. Non-use value is divided into existence, altruistic, and bequest value. So direct value is basically the direct value that we get from these products, forest products. Indirect value is basically watershed benefits, ecosystem services, things that we get indirectly, and we don't basically directly look for it through forests and stuff. And then the options, which is basically there's an option for future direct and indirect use of this biodiversity. Then we have existence value, which is basically the value derived from the knowledge that these resources exist. Then altruistic value, which is basically that even though you are not using the resource, someone else is using somewhere, and that knowledge that someone else is using the resource somewhere makes you gives some value to you. Then bequest value, which is basically the value of giving the use and non-use values for offsprings or future generations. So basically in the option value, you are basically keeping it, then you might end up making a decision. But in bequest value, you are basically giving the ownership, transferring the ownership to the offspring or the little further generation. So basically, they can do what they want based on their needs. Right. And there are three accepted approaches to evaluation. So the first thing is market prices or revealed willingness to pay, where basically they see how much people are spending to go and let's say go to Ghana National Park, right? How much money people are spending. So maybe in that national park is worth at least that much, right? Then we have imputed willingness to pay or circumstantial evidence, where basically we calculate what is the replacement or substitute cost, what is the cost that we get, that we might get if we damage this. What is the cost that we add because of the damages due to our basically absence of this patch of forest, something like that, right? Or some other area. So basically, this is like you're finding if that is not there, how much money will I spend, right? By doing a damage cost that is avoided, by calculating the damage cost that is avoided, or calculating the substitute cost. Now, in the third thing, you are basically doing surveys. You are seeing expressed willingness to pay. So, how much are people willing to pay? How much do people value it? Right? Does anyone have any doubts till now? Yeah. So next we have week three, ecological interactions. So what are interactions? Interaction basically effects that the organisms in a community have on each other. That's called interactions, such as this bee is pollinating the flower, so it's interacting with it and it's having an effect. It's making the flower pollinate so that it can reproduce. And the flower is providing nectar, which is food. Right. So these are the effects. And these animals have on each other, and that is known as basically interaction. There can be interspecific or interspecific interactions. Interspecific interactions are basically interactions that are within a given species. So, for example, these birds probably fighting or singing, right? So that's interspecific interaction. Whereas interspecific interaction is interaction between two or more different species. So, for example, these clownfish live with these three animals. They have a mutualistic relationship where basically they are taking advantage of that sea animal as it protects them. Right? And they are, we say the clownfish is resistant to the toxin that is produced by the sea animal, so it can go and hide there where its predators might come and basically get caught in the web. Right. Then interactions can also be termed as harmonious or inharmonious. Harmonious interactions are positive ecological interaction where none of the organisms are harmed. Inharmonious interactions are negative ecological interactions where at least one of the participating organisms is harmed. Right. Harmonious ecological interactions can be interspecific, such as colonies and societies, and they can be interspecific, such as proto-cooperation, mutualism, and commensalism. Right. Colonies are basically aggregates formed by individuals of the same species. Societies are basically society of ant, wasp, and bees, where they have basically this labor division and collaboration between different individuals of the same species. Then we have proto-cooperation, where basically uh, two animals are cooperating. For example, these birds are eating of pests, parasites, ectoparasites of giraffes, or basically these hermit crab and sea anemone. Basically, the sea anemone is moving around and it provides benefits to the hermit crab. But these are not obligatory, so they won't. So these birds won't die if they don't show this behavior. The hermit crab or the sea anemone won't die, or the giraffe won't die. Right. So these are not obligatory for this survival. That's why they're called as cooperation. Mutualism is basically obligatory survival thing. So, for example, leguminous plants have root nodules where there are nitrogen fixing bacteria that fix atmospheric nitrogen and nitrous compounds that can be taken up by the plants. And basically, the plants then provide food to these rhizobia. Right. Next, we have commensalism, where basically it's plus zeros. So the crane here is basically the egrets and the cranes are basically uh, eating with the buffalo. So as the buffalo moves and eats grass, there are like perturbations in the grass and a lot of insects and all come out. And basically, these egrets eat them. So the buffalo is not getting any benefit, but the egret is getting any benefit. The buffalo is not harmed, the egret is not harmed. The third is the harmonious interspecific interaction. Right. Inharmonious ecological interactions, interspecific inharmonious ecological interactions are interspecific competition and cannibalism. Interspecific inharmonious interactions are interspecific competition, parasitism, predation, and commensalism. So competition is basically when two animals have the same ecological niche, they compete for that. And if it's like partially or fully coinciding, then competition basically ensures that one of the species which is better at using the resource will survive. Uh, Competition will be inter and interspecific. Interspecific competition is between different species. Interspecific competition is between same species. Next, we have exploitative and interference competition, where basically exploitative competition is when you're directly competing for the same resource. So, for example, these black bucks are eating and the cow comes in and starts grazing. So that's exploitative competition. Interference competition is when basically you're preventing access to the resource. Right. So when the cows come in, let's say the humans are building a wall, and that's where these you're interfering, or there are dogs that are basically barking and chasing away the black ducks. There's interference, and there's a denial of access to resource. Right. In exploitation, organisms are using a resource direct interference. One organism prevents the other from using the resource. Right. Exploitative competition, there's no direct contact. Interference competition, there is a direct contact or a conflict. So these are the main points. Then, yes, so we talked about some examples of all of these. We talked about what is apparent competition. Apparent competition is basically if two prey species have a common predator and increase in the population of one prey species might lead to the increase in the population of the predator species, thus leading to a higher predation pressure on the second species, right? So this basically the apparent competition. So they have this indirect competition between them, where basically the predation pressure is basically affected by the other prey of your predator. Right. We talked about some characteristics of apparent competition. We talked about some examples. Then we talked about some consequences of competition, such as niche differentiation. So if two species are competing for the same niche and one of them is evidently better than the other, the second species can adapt to a different niche that might be available in the given area. And the second thing is habitat displacement. So sometimes what happens is if uh, there's competition, indirect there's basically interference competition mostly. It leads to habitat displacement, where basically the original inhabitants of a prime habitat are moved into a subprime habitat because of arrival of other competitors. Then cannibalism is also inharmonious in class-specific interaction, where basically species consume their mates mostly. Praying mantises and black widows consume their mates after mating. Right. Then parasitism. Parasitism is an ecological interaction in which an organism lives at the expense of another. Parasites can be ectoparasites, which are on the outside of your skin, such as leeches or endoparasites, such as Plasmodium vivax, which causes malaria. Then we talked about predation, where basically one individual mutilates or kills another to get food or to eat. Then we have commensalism, uh, where basically where an organism inflicts harm to another organism without cost or benefits received by itself. So it's minus zero. So, for example, these black bugs that are going and trampling on grasses while they're feeding, basically the grass is dying, but nothing's happening to them. So this table summarizes all the different ecological interactions and what is the impact on first organism, what is the impact on second organism. Then we talked about behavior and behavioral ecology, where we talked about behavior, which is the way that organisms respond to each other and to particular cues in the environment. Then we talked about ethology, which is the scientific study of animal behavior. Behavior ecology is basically the study of evolutionary basis of animal behavior due to ecological pressures. Then we talked about what are some study topics such as foraging behavior, anti-predator behavior, social behavior, mating behavior. We talked about cost-benefit analysis. So, for example, you know, there's an assessment of to determine whether the cost of an activity is less than the benefit that can be expected from that activity for a given organism. So if for example, for maintaining a territory that is large, there's a much higher cost than maintaining a territory that is small. So the cost of maintaining a territory increases, and whereas the benefit after some time becomes stable at a given point. Because even if you have a very large territory, you can only run around and use so much of it. Right. So basically, this tells you that the optimum territory size is the one where the difference between the cost and the benefit is the highest, or the profit is the highest. Right. Uh, then we talked about why do lions live in groups? What does group size help in things? So what are the costs and benefits of living in groups? So cost of grouping can be sharing of paternity, lower rate of food intake because there are more people. Benefits will be increased access to mates and protection of offspring against infanticide in males, and help from kin and territorial defense, help from kin in raising children, and territorial defense for females. Then basically these wolves hunt in packs and then eat. So if an individual wolf goes and tries to hunt, it's much more difficult for it than if a group is hunting, right? So potential benefits of group living animals are increasing foraging efficiency, reduce predation, increase access to mates, and help from kin. Whereas potential cause competition for food increases of diseases of parasites, attraction of predators, loss of fraternity, group parasitism, loss of individual liberation. Like then we talked about altruism in these ground squirrels, where basically they are making uh, sounds or alarm calls to alert other people based on different. Uh, so these are segregated according to their demography, and they figure out that females tend to be more altruistic than males. Then we talked about the concept of kin selection, where basically there is an evolution of traits that increase the survival and reproductive success of one's own relatives. So even if you are dying, you make sure that your relatives are surviving. Then we talked about group selection. So basically, natural selection working at the level of groups rather than individuals. So it's basically natural selection that is leading to the adoption of traits that are basically favoring groups rather than individuals. Right. Uh, so group selection is a slightly weaker selective force than uh, natural selection, individual selection, because it operates much more slowly. Once- Then we talked about Hamilton's rule, where basically we saw that what is so basically the cost benefit thing of uh, what do you say? So when you are basically becoming altruistic, you are helping out your siblings or your relatives. Uh, Hamilton said that it makes sense if RP is greater than C for you to be altruistic and not otherwise, where R is the genetic relatedness between you and the person who is receiving on the receiving end of the altruistic act, and B is the additional reproductive benefit that is gained by the recipient. So, did you save their life? Did you do something? And C is basically the cost that you are getting. Did you lose your life? Did you do something like you're getting handicapped or something like that, maybe? So, then we talked about Haldane statement, where basically if an individual loses its life to save two siblings, four nephews, or eight cousins, it's a fair deal in evolutionary terms. As siblings are on average 50% identical by descent, nephews are 25 and cousins are 12.5. Right. Then we talked about territoriality, which is another behavior that is shown in animals. It's a type of interspecific and interspecific competition that results from behavioral exclusion of others from a specific space that is defined as a territory. Um, Territoriality, animal territoriality basically excludes conspecifics or occasionally animals of other species from certain areas using auditory, visual, olfactory signals as well as aggressive behaviors. Okay. So there are costs to territorial behavior. There's increased energy usage, increased time demands, increased risk of predation because you're being more vocal, being more aggressive. So predators can spot you easily. But there are also benefits such as exclusive access to resources. Then it reduces competition and it regulates the size of the population. Right. Uh, then we talked about how different animals have different uh, patterns of time activity, patterns of activity. So cheetahs are basically trying to avoid tigers, so they are active at different times than tigers. Whereas animals such as wolf and coyote have a much more similar um, activity pattern because they are both hunters and they are probably active at the same time to hunt the prey. Right. We talked about ethogram, which is basically inventory of behaviors that are exhibited by an animal during a behavior exercise. We talked about how we can make an ethogram by doing a description of the study site, what is present in that study site, is there a river, is there a tree, what kind of tree, and all that things. Then we define behaviors, different behaviors that can be shown by the animal. Then we do a scan sampling. In the scan sampling method, we basically at each beginning of each time observation, we basically scan the whole group and note the different activities that all the different individuals are displaying. Then we can do a focal animal study where we are just looking at one organism, one individual of population, and we're basically seeing what that organism is doing from this time to this time, right, throughout the day. Then, based on that, we can do a time budget analysis to figure out and answer questions, such behavioral questions, and basically make studies. So, for example, if you want to look at if male and female birds are providing different kinds of parental care or different amounts of parental care, what you can do is just make observations of both male and female birds, then do a time budget analysis and see how much each like how much a male bird is investing in uh, behaviors that are basically uh, mm, providing parental care for their children, and how much females are uh, investing in parental care for the chicks. Right. Does anyone have any questions till now? Okay. In week 4, we talked about ecological energetics, where we basically talked about food chains, food webs, and trophic levels. Food chain is basically a chain where basically one organism is eating the other, and so on and so on. And food energy is getting uh, transferred from the source, which is basically autotrophs or chemoautotrophs, to basically decomposers. Right. So autotrophs are basically organisms that are primary producers. They can basically create food out of life, right? For example, plants, or also from chemicals. Heterotrophs are organisms that cannot produce their own food and hence they rely on the intake of nutrition from other sources, mainly plant and animal matter. Autotrophs can be photoautotrophs, which are basically using light as a source of energy to manufacture organic molecules, or chemoautotrophs, which are basically organisms that use chemical reactions as a source of energy to manufacture organic molecules. Right. Mm. Then we have basically more definitions. A producer is an organism that makes its own food, or consumer is an organism that consumes some other organism for its food. Then there are different kinds of consumers. Primary consumer only consumes producers. Secondary consumer consumes a primary consumer. Tertiary consumers consume secondary consumer. Quaternary consumer consumes the tertiary consumer, and so on. Then we have definitions of herbivore, carnivore, omnivore, and decomposer. Herbivore eats basically plant material. Carnivore eats animal material. Omnivore eats both, and decomposer basically converts dead material into soil and recycles nutrient, completing the biogeochemical cycles, which we talked about later. There are two kinds of food chains we talked about, the detritus food chain and the grazing food chain. The detritus food chain starts from detritus, goes through detritivores to carnivores. So detritivores, then detritivores are consumed by detritivore consumers, such as fish or insect larvae, which are then consumed by smaller fish and then larger fish, and finally fish piscivorous birds, let's say. And the grazing food chain basically starts from plant base and goes through herbivores to carnivores. Then again, we can have predator food chains and parasite food chains. Predator food chain is basically uh, where basically grass is eaten by cheetal and cheetal is predated upon by tiger. Parasite food chain is basically rat is infested by flea and flea is infested by a parasitic protozoa. So in predator food chain, the size of organism generally increases as we move up the chain, and in a parasitic food chain, the size of organism generally decreases as we move up the chain. And then we talked about differences between grazing and detritus food chain. Basically, what is the first trophic level, how long they are, what is the primary source of energy. These are the differences. So primary source of energy is sun for grazing food chain and detritus for detritus food chain. First trophic level is herbivores for grazing food chains. First trophic level is detritivores for detritus food chain. And generally grazing food chains are much longer than detritus food chains. When we talked about food webs. So food chain is a single line, but in real life, that is not the case. There are multiple animals that can eat multiple other animals and can be eaten by multiple other animals. Right. So what we have in real life is something called a food web. So it's a system of interlocking and interdependent food chains. Trophic level is basically each of the several hierarchical levels in an ecosystem consisting of organisms sharing the same function in the food chain and the same nutrition relationship to the primary resources of energy. So all tertiary consumers are at a given trophic level. All secondary consumers are at a given trophic level. All primary producers are belong to a given trophic level and so on. Right. So yeah, basically primary producers, help your consumers, first level consumers. So basically secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and so. Okay. Uh, we talked about the ecological pyramid, which is a graphical representation to show the biomass numbers or energy at the each trophic level in a given ecosystem. It's also known as trophic pyramid, Eltonian pyramid, energy pyramid, or food pyramid. So there are three kinds of pyramids: pyramid of numbers, pyramid of energy, and pyramid of biomass. So basically, this pyramid of numbers tells you how many number of organisms are there at each trophic level. And in general, it's like a pyramid, but there's a pyramid of inverted numbers that happens in basically uh, these kind of food chains, parasitic food chains, right? Because you have producers which are present in let's say small numbers, and then one tree can have 100 birds, like 10 birds, right? Each of those birds can have like 10, 20 bugs on them, and each of those bugs can have 10, 20 fleas and so on. So the pyramid here is inverted, and the number of hyperparasites is much more than the number of produce. Right. We also have spindle-shaped pyramid of numbers in some ecosystems, and we have dumbbell-shaped pyramid of numbers in some ecosystems. Pyramid of energy basically tells you how much energy is present in a given trophic level. As you move on, so there's this 10% rule, which basically says that approximately 10% of the energy is harvested at a lower trophic level, is transferred up to the next higher trophic level. Most of the rest of it is lost or used up by the trophic level below. Then the pyramid of biomass basically is how much biomass is present at each trophic level. We can also have inverted pyramid of biomass because, uh, especially in season where basically these phytoplanktons and zooplanktons can basically help grow these help support these large population of small and large fishes because of their high reproductive rates, even if their population sizes are small. Right. Then we talked about a few more definitions, such as a standing crop. What does a standing crop means? The total dried biomass of the living organism at a trophic level. And we talked about ecological efficiency, so the efficiency with which energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next. We talked about exploitation efficiency, which is basically the amount of food ingested divided by the amount of pre-production, and assimilation efficiency, which is the amount of assimilation divided by the amount of food ingested. So how much you are getting versus how much you are eating is assimilation. Exploitation is how much you are eating versus how much is available out there. Right. Next, we talk about gross production efficiency, net production efficiency, and how we can calculate, use all these things to calculate the ecological efficiency. So basically, it's the exploit its multiplication of all four of them. Right. Then we talked about a 10% rule, where basically at each trophic level, only about 10% of the energy is gets stored as biomass. Remaining is either lost during transfer, lost due to incomplete digestion, or broken down in respiration. Okay. The only thing to note here is that in the first step, uh, when we are near the producers, this thing is not 10%, this is 1%. So the energy from the sun, only 1% of it is harvested by the plants, and in the rest, all of the trophic levels, 10% of the energy is harvested. Right. Uh, we have this formula of how to calculate the energy that is available at a given trophic level. We talked about trophic cascades, which basically how ecological basically, which is the ecological phenomenon that is triggered by the addition or removal of top predators and involves reciprocal changes in populations of many different predators and prey through the food chain and results in dramatic changes in the ecosystem structure and nutrient cycling. So basically here, the example is shown is basically in the Yellowstone National Park. There was a lot of overpopulation of deers, and because of that, there was not a lot of grass and greenery. So what they did was they started introducing these wolves. So what happened was slowly these deers population started decreasing, and after some time, these deers started avoiding certain areas that gave rise to uh, that basically gave way to niche for other organisms such as bears and other herbivores to come and basically stay there, right? And that led to a higher uh, biodiversity and eventually change the course of the river that was passing through it. So basically, a trophic cascade is that ecological phenomenon, which is basically triggered by removal of or addition of top predator, and basically affects all trophic levels. Then we talked about primary production, which is basically what is primary production, what are autotrophs, what is the importance of primary production, and basically, uh, yeah, what is gross primary production, which is basically energy fixed via photosynthesis per unit time. What is net primary production, which is energy lost via respiration per unit time. And the compensation point is basically where both of them are equal. So where the photosynthesis equals respiration. Then we talked about how we measure these production values. We talked about the radioisotope method, where you basically put some radioisotope of carbon and see how it is decaying, and to estimate basically what is the rate of respiration, what is the rate of what is the rate of respiration, right? To measure the primary productivity, what we do is we basically uh, utilize you calculate, use the amount of gas that is released, carbon dioxide or oxygen, to calculate how much energy is used. Right. The harvest method is basically uh, you take the biomass of plant at time t2 and your biomass at time t1, and you basically subtract it. Right. So that is the amount of biomass that is produced or lost. Efficiency is basically how much energy is fixed by gross primary production or net primary production divided by how much energy is incident because of the sunlight. Right. Productivity is basically production divided by time. Net primary productivity is given as APR into LUV, where APR is basically observed photosynthetically active radiation and LU is light use efficiency. So how much radiation you have absorbed into how efficient you are. So using satellite data and all this, and through modeling, people are calculating all these. So these productivity depends on a lot of different things. One of those is the solar constant. So solar constant is the rate at which the sun's energy is reaching the Earth's surface. Then the latitude, the cloudiness. If it's cloudy, there's less sunlight, less energy, dust and water in the atmosphere. The arrangement of leaves. If leaves are spread out, then they can gather more light. If leaves are like one below the other, they can't gather that much light. Then concentration of carbon dioxide also affects the productivity. Next, we talk about different basically kinds of lakes based on their primary productivity. So we have oligotrophic lakes, which are basically have very low primary productivity as a result of low nutrient content, and they have low algal population and have very clear waters of high drinking quality. So, for example, there is Somaridi in Ladakh. Mesotrophic lake has some kind of intermediate level of productivity, some algae, some other plants, and all that. Eutrophic lake has a very high biological productivity due to excessive concentration of nutrients, especially nitrogen and phosphorus. Hypereutrophic lake is basically the extreme one, which basically has severe nuisance algae blooms and low oxygen levels, often leading to death of fishes and all other organs. Right. So to make these classifications, there are multiple things that are measured. One is the amount of chlorophyll, amount of phosphorus, and other things. The other thing is Secchi depth. A Secchi depth is a measure of transparency or turbidity of a water body. So the more depth, uh, so basically you put a disc that has black and white, and you basically have a rod, and you dip it in a column, and till when you can see the different white and black parts is the depth. So if the water is more clear, you can see for more deeper, so the Secchi depth is higher. If the water is more turbid, then the Secchi depth is lower. Then in these ponds and lakes and all that, the so major source of nutrient is rivers which bring in sediments, bird droppings which lead to nitrogen, upwelling in the ocean. Upwelling is basically when due to wind and other flow of currents, the water that is below the surface comes to the top. Right. Yeah, dust clouds and all that also bring nutrients. Once we know all these things, what we can do is we can basically control algal blooms or remove algal blooms wherever it's needed. So, and we can also uh, basically increase the amount of. So now we know that iron is the limiting resource for creating chlorophyll. So what we can do is basically use iron and throw it around in marine places so that more and more oxygen is produced, not a global warming and things like that. Great. Then we talked about nutrient cycles, where we talked about nutrient, which is basically a substance used by an organism to survive, reproduce, and grow. There are different kinds of nutrients, macronutrients, which are needed in large amounts and generally include primary nutrients and secondary nutrients. Micronutrients are basically trace elements which are needed in smaller trace amounts. These generally include many metals. There's many elements such as boron, copper, iron, fluorine, manganese, zinc, and so on. Essential elements are basically elements which have these three uh, characteristics. So the first is in the absence of the element, the plant should be unable to complete the life cycle. Second is the deficiency of an essential element cannot be met by supplying some other element. The third is the element must be directly involved in the metabolism of the plant. So these three qualities, if an element has, it becomes an essential element, such as calcium. Right. So we talked about some essential elements and the roles that they fulfill, and these roles are not interchangeable. So you can't basically add instead of nitrogen, you can just give a plant phosphorus so that it can basically create hormones or do other things, right? We talked about basically what are different macronutrients, what are different micronutrients that plants need. Biogeochemical cycle is basically a pathway by which chemical substances move through both the biosphere and the abiotic components, which are lithosphere, atmosphere, and hydrosphere compartments of the earth. So this is how a generalized nutrient cycle looks. So basically, you have the sun, which gives out light, and producers use this light to produce food. This is fed into the herbivores. When plants or producers are dying, they get basically, yeah, produces which are eaten up by herbivores which are eaten up by carnivores. And where all three of them die, they are all decomposed by decomposers, which basically put the nutrient somewhere in the soil nutrient pool or something, which is then taken up by the producer. So this is a generalized nutrient cycle. You can see similarities across different cycles such as nitrogen cycle, uh, carbon cycle, water cycle, and phosphorus cycle. So in the nitrogen cycle, we have many different steps. So first thing is nitrogen fixation, so which is here. So nitrogen that is present in the atmosphere needs to be converted into a form that can be present in the soil. So basically, conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. It can occur by biological fixation. Lightning can also lead to nitrogen fixation, and nowadays we have industrial fixation where we are producing this as fertilizers. Then in biological nitrogen fixation, what happens is basically nitrogen is this enzyme is used to convert nitrogen into ammonia. It is done by rhizobium, which is found in leguminous plants, azotobacter, nostoc, and anamina. Then ammonification is basically the production of ammonia through decomposition of organic nitrogen in dead plants and animals. So dead plants and animals, by the process of ammonification, are converted into ammonia. So here ammonification. Then we have nitrification, where basically oxidation of ammonia creates nitrites and nitrates. This is also facilitated by bacteria such as Nitrobacter, Nitrosomonas, and Nitrococcus. These are chemoautotrophs, which are basically carrying out these equations to feed themselves. Right. In industrial nitrogen fixation, which was given by Haber, this is known as Haber's process. What we are doing is we are adding basically nitrogen plus hydrogen in the presence of a catalyst at a very high temperature and pressure gets converted into ammonia. Then we have Ostwald process, which leads this ammonia, which converts this ammonia into nitrates and nitrates. Next, we have the carbon cycle, where basically the carbon is present in many different pools. It's present in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, it's present in the rocks, it's present in the ocean water, it's present on all life on Earth. So they basically carbon from the atmosphere can evaporate and dissolve in the ocean water due to weathering and tectonics. It can basically move from the carbon in rocks to carbon in atmosphere. Photosynthesis converts atmospheric carbon into biotic carbon, which is then consumed by other animals and moves through the trophic layers. Then basically, lithification is when these things get buried deep down under the earth and basically are converted into fossil fuels. Then combustion, decomposition, respiration are processes that basically again lead rise to carbon dioxide production. And water cycle, I think this is something all of us know about. Basically, water evaporates from different places, such as rivers, seas, and lakes, and so on. There's also transpiration that's going on due to plants. Plants are basically giving out water. That's why it feels cooler when you're near a plant, right? So transpiration, evaporation, then basically condensation happens. There's a lot of rain precipitation. Then there's infiltration, where basically water seeps through the uh, solid layers of earth to go into the groundwater, or some of it can also run off into different oceans, lakes, and ponds. Then the phosphorus cycle again. uh, Phosphates, rock phosphates are converted to soil phosphates, which are used up by plants and then eaten up by animals, living organisms, and other. Then microbes then again converted back into soil phosphates, which then can run off to water bodies. And when they are sedimented, they become rock phosphates. Then we talked about the sulfur cycle, where basically uh, there's a lot of, what do you say, sulfur that is created due to volcanic eruptions, due to basically a lot of fossil fuel combustion. Then when it rains, if there's sulfur in the air, then sulfur, it leads to acidic rain, and that leads to deposition in many different places, right? There's some dry deposition also going out. Uh, yeah, you see that is a sulfur cycle. Then we talked about how as humans we are intervening and what are the impacts that we are creating. So we are basically have a lot of different impacts that we can create. So by deforestation, people have shown that it leads to changes in the stream flow. It leads to changes in the amount of transpiration, understory, soil litter or evaporation and runoff that is going on. So it affects the water cycle also. Post deforestation, there are changes in pH, changes in ion concentration in different places, right? So these are the effects that we can directly or indirectly we are creating because of deforestation. Right. In week 5, we talked about population ecology, where we talked about population parameter and demographic techniques. Population, as we talked about, is the same group of species living in the same particular geographical area. Then basically we talked about how populations change. We talked about natality, which is birth, mortality, which is death, immigration and emigration. We talked about the PDCA cycle, how we can basically uh, get the number of individuals that are present in a given uh, area and basically uh, plan things for their survival, for their betterment, for increasing biodiversity, and implement, check, and then again act and react on it. Then we talked about what is the importance of assessing these things, assessing the numbers of wildlife. Uh, we talked about many different things, such as um, so basically, it helps us assess the risk of population decline or crash. What happens if there is a population crash? How can a population crash? If there are very low individuals, then population will crash for a lot of different reasons, such as demographic stochasticity, chance variation, chance in birth and death, sex ratio, and all that. Environmental stochasticity, such as drought, blood, famine, diseases, genetic problems such as interbreeding, invading depression, genetic drift, and so on. Behavioral problems and alley effect. Alley effect is basically when animals are like dispersed from their group, they basically mm, are less efficient. So 5 wolves can, let's say, hunt down 10 meals a day, but one wolf cannot hunt down two because it gets much more difficult for it. Right. Then, yeah, we talked about importance of assessment, how it can help us in adaptation and mitigation. What are numbers? What are trends? Trends are basically indicators. Is the number going up or is the number going down? But numbers are actual numbers. You can go from numbers to trends, but not the other way around. Uh, as managerial scientists, we are interested in knowing about population size, population density, and some other demographic information about the population that we can use for maintaining them. Then we talked about kinds of population density, which is absolute density, which is the numbers per unit area, and relative density, whether area A has higher organisms or area B has higher organisms. Right. Then we talked about how do we measure absolute population density and so on. Total count, sampling methods, removal method. What is the objective of sampling? We talked about what are sampling units and frames. A list of sampling units is called a frame. A sampling unit is a unit where you're basically going and sampling. It can be an administrative unit or natural unit, right? Sample is basically one or more sampling units selected from the population. Intensity of sampling is the ratio of number of units uh, in the sample to the number of units in the population. And different kinds of sampling. There's simple random sampling where you are just randomly picking out units to sample. There's systematic sampling where you're basically selecting every kth unit, starting with a randomly chosen one. Then the stratified sampling, where you basically are dividing the population into different batches of subpopulations because they are represented unequally, and basically you're sampling from them. Uh, right. Then we have multi-stage sampling, where you are basically sampling and then subsampling and creating choosing things to sample in the subsample. Then we have PPS sampling, probability proportional to size, where basically when the units are varying in their size and the variable under study is related to the size of the unit. So the probability is assigned based on the size of the unit. So you are more likely to find bigger units and less likely to find smaller units. Then we talked about the capture recapture method or the mark recapture method. So basically what you do is you go out, you capture some animals, you mark them and you release them. After some time you go back, you capture them and you check for marks. And based on this equation, you can figure out what is the total population size. It makes some assumptions though that marked and unmarked animals are captured randomly. There's the mortality rate and marked and unmarked animals is the same and marks are not overlooked or lost. Like, uh, then we have another method, which is basically the removal method, which also helps us estimate the density of population density. Uh, yeah, you basically remove a few organisms and you basically try to fit in this equation. We can estimate the relative population density using number of their indirect methods, such as some traps, calculating number of fecal pellets, frequency of vocalization, catch per unit fishing effort, then what is the percentage of plant cover, and so on. Right. So we want to get at many different information as managers and writers, and we want to basically use these to basically improve physiological and ecological longevity of individuals in a population. Right. Um, yeah. So yeah. Then whatever numbers or estimates we are calculating, we need it to be both precise and accurate. So uh, yeah, basically, uh, precise means all of them are like uh, all the values that we are getting are similar to each other. Accurate means all the values are almost similar to the actual value. Right. So we want both. We want it to be both accurate and precise. Uh, Precise measurements are said to have bias if they are not accurate. So basically, precise measurements, since they are clustered together, they are similar measurements. There might be some bias or something that is deviating the measurement that you're taking from the real value. And to remove bias, we can basically recalibrate or change our method of measurement. Right, remove bias. We talked about population growth and regulation. There are a few examples where we calculated things. Uh, yeah, basically we calculated mean group size, standard deviation and all that by taking average and using standard deviation formula and all. Then we talked about how we can sample rainforest herpetofauna using opportunistic encounters, complete species inventory, and visual encounter surveys. We talked about quarter sampling, distance sampling, and patch sampling, audio strips, transact, and mark capture methods. Uh, okay. Yeah, basically opportunity encounter is if you're opportunistically just encountering the animal, like while you are just going out on a walk or something, right? Uh, Complete species inventory is you're inventorying the whole species. Visual encounter surveys, you're going looking for that animal. Quadrate sampling is when you're sampling in quadrates. Distance sampling is basically you're doing a transit line and looking for like in this distance they're present or not. Patch sampling is you select patches and you go there and sample. Audio strip transit is you are going in a transit and recording audio or listening to audio. Market capture methods we talked about. Pitfall or funnel trapping is when you are basically putting a bucket and putting some soap solution and letting them jump into that by making a hole in the ground or making them come there using logs and stuff. Then basically cover board surveys at breeding sites, quantitative sampling of larvae, and instrumentation such as camera traps or passive sensors. Right. Uh, mm, some examples of like traps can be pan traps for pollinators. So because these are these pollinators come and try to sit on it, but once they try to sit on it, they die because the solution is like soap solution or something that's there to kill them. Right. So you can collect them. Uh, Yeah, so basically describe how you'll plan population monitoring of species with distinct marks. So what we can do is we can basically, since they have distinct marks, we don't need to mark them. We can just take photos and basically we take photos one day, we go and we see what all different animals are there based on the marks. Right. And then next we go some other day and again basically take some photos and see if how many of the animals that we found in the second time. Let's say you took 50 photos first, 50 photos second time. How many photos did you of the 50 in the second batch are present in the first batch also? Based on that, we can calculate the ratio and estimate the population size. He talked about population growth, how the logistic growth equation looks. He talked about predator prey relations, which is Lotka-Volterra equations. and how basically they govern prey and predator abundances. We talked about population studies and their applications. So, how does the population change with time? What determines the equilibrium conditions and average values? So when we're looking at dynamics of population, we have questions like: does the change occur at a particular time of the year? Does the change occur in a particular stage of the life cycle? What change or agents operate at these stages? Right. Agents can be extrinsic agents such as weathers, predators, parasite diseases, or intrinsic agents such as physiological or behavioral responses. So when we are looking at problem of statics, the population size is not changing, so dynamic factors need not be considered. We want to manipulate habitat variables and see why the population size is what is it, and why is the population size fixed at this. Right. Then we talked about the locust problem, where basically locusts have these two different forms, solitary and gregarious, and how basically they uh, people have studied those two forms and then figured out how they change phases from the solitary phase to this gregarious phase by a transient phase, and then basically how these behavioral changes and physiological changes lead to morphological changes and lead to a vicious plague of swarm formation where these locusts then come and basically destroy the crops. Right. So yeah, basically there's multiplication when there's concentration where there are more individuals in a given small area. Then there's aggregation where more and more aggregate. Then once they are mutually inhabiting, there's like basically visual compensation. This gregariousness starts, and slowly it becomes more and more gregarious, and then gregarious basically means they're flocking together, and solitary basically means they're alone. And then we see certain other changes such as color change, specific gravity change, morphological change, and there's an increase in fecundity. This increase in fecundity helps it grow more and feeds back into this swarm thing. And once the swarm is basically out of space, what it does is it moves and it emigrates. And if there are multiple swarms, they can fuse together and all those things basically leads to the formation of a plague by locust. People are still researching on these things in much more detail. And people are trying to find out what specific things are causing these phase transitions and making these solitary uh, grasshoppers or locusts become gregarious. Then in week 6, we discussed about community ecology. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, in week six, we talked about community ecology, where we talked about what is a community, basically assemblage of population of organisms in a given area or habitat. They may or may not belong to the same species. Then ecotone, we talked about ecotone. Ecotone is basically a transition area where two communities meet and integrate. It may be sharp or diffuse. So here we see a sharp ecotone because between this forest and the grassland. Right. We talked about community attributes such as co-occurrence of species. So some species will co-occur in a given community. Reoccurrence of groups of the same species. So if the same mm, uh, so co-occurrence of species is basically this sal plus mallotus. They are frequently co-occurring in many different places. Recurrence of groups of the same species, basically, if this co-occurrence thing happens in more and more places, uh, that are far apart. That means this is leading to a recurrence of groups of the same species and homeostasis of self-regulation. So basically what happens is in the community, if one population is like slightly changed, then eventually like mechanisms such as prey, predator, trophic chains and all that come into play and basically try to maintain the population of that, try to maintain that, bring back that population to the original level, whether it was higher or lower. Right. Now, community characteristics are things that are different across communities. Attributes are things that are similar across communities. Characteristics are species diversity, growth form and structure, dominance, relative abundance, and trophic structure. Uh, then we talked about how do we describe a community using the species richness, abundance, and species dominance. Dominance is basically ranking as per abundance. So based on the number, basal area, etc. Based on all these things, the relative density, relative frequency, relative dominance, we can assign importance of a species X. Importance value ranges from 0 to 100. Then if two species are associating or not, we can easily figure it out by doing a quadrat sampling and sorry, making a contingency table. If we see a lot of type A and type D interactions, that means these species are associating, because whenever species X is present, species Y is present. Whenever species X is not present, species Y is not present. However, if there are more and more types of type B and type C interaction, that means these species might be avoiding each other. And that's why they're present alternatively. Then we talked about some community theories, such as Clement's organismic theory, where he says that the community is a superorganism or a discrete unit with sharp boundaries, and basically it's it has emergent properties. Then Gleason had an individualistic or a continuum theory, where basically he said that the abundance of a population of a species changes gradually along complex environmental gradients, and these are not structured. So communities are not structured, but they arise out of chance. Not out of chance, but out of basically the restrictions of different organisms to survive in different kind of climate and weather. Whereas the Hubbard's neutral theory says that species are functionally equivalent, and the abundance of population of species changes by random births and deaths, and community formation is random. Right. And then we talked about guilds. A guild is a group of species which utilize resources in a similar way, such as a group of fruit-eating birds in a rainforest, a group of forest floor-dwelling herbs, and so on. Because species within a guild utilize the same resources, there is a high amount of competition between guilds, between species in the same guild and species in different guilds. Right. Then we talked about niche, the ecological niche, the basically multidimensional description of its resource needs, habitat requirements, and environmental tolerances. So every organism or every species has a given niche where basically they stay. Right. Then we talked about fundamental niche, which is basically the potential set of conditions within which a species can occupy. And we also talked about realized niche, which is the set of conditions that the species is actually occupying due to competition, predation, and other pressures. Right. It's also known as post-competitive niche. And fundamental niche is also known as pre-competitive niche. So always fundamental niche is greater than or equal to the realized niche. Realized niche may differ for the population of same species might differ based on the area, because there might be different conditions in different areas or different uh, species in different areas. Right. Specialist species have narrow niches. Generally, species have broad niches because specialists only feed on certain things and all that. And generalists can feed on anything. Right. Uh, yeah, the fundamental niche elaborates what all the various roles of the species are, whereas the realized niche elaborates on what the species are actually doing. And special species are well adapted to their realized niche because that's where they're staying. Then we talked about index of similarity, where basically how we can calculate the similarity of two communities based on the number of species that they have. Then we talked about association of a species with community, how species are associating with the community. Is that like an accidental species that is randomly found here, or is it an exclusive species that is only found in this community? So there are different basically steps: accidental species and different species, preferential species, selective and exclusive species, and it gets more and more exclusive as we move from accidental to exclusive. Then we talked about community changes in ecological succession. We talked about so ecological succession is the process of change of species structure of an ecological community over time. Uh, we talked about how it happens from bare rocks to crustose lichen to foliose lichen to moss. Then basically how these things lead to weathering of rocks, basically the freezing of water, action of the sun, crystallization of soil, and chemical action of roots lead to weathering of rocks, forming soil, which then leads to herbaceous and shrubbaceous growths, finally leading into the forest stage, which is the final climax community. CR is basically an intermediate stage found in the intermediate ecological succession in a common ecosystem, advancing towards its climax community. CRs can be of many types. Hydrosphere is a community in water, geosphere is a community in a dry area, lithosphere is a community on rock, thermosphere is a community on sand, halosphere is a community in a saline body. We have pioneer species, which are basically hardy species, which can establish themselves in a very disruptive ecosystem and trigger the process of ecological succession. Uh, then we have basically climax community, which is basically a community of plants and animals and fungi, which through the process of ecological succession, uh, over a large period of time in a given area, have reached a steady state. There are no more new species coming in, no more uh, changes, climatic and other changes that are coming in. Right. So, yeah, we talked about what are the different characteristics of climax community. Then we talked about what are the different kinds of succession: primary succession, secondary, and cyclic succession. Primary succession is succession of succession and inhabitation of an area that has never been previously occupied by ecological community. Secondary succession is basically succession following a severe disturbance or removal of pre-existing community. Cyclic succession is basically periodically it happens because, for example, let's say there are forest fires every year, or people are cutting down trees every 2 3 years. Then we talked about some examples of primary succession in different spheres. Secondary succession. Secondary and cyclic succession are, of course, faster than primary succession because there are spores and seeds already present, soil is already formed, regeneration is there from the roots of the plants, and soil fertility is typically high enough. Uh, Succession can also be divided into autogenic and allogenic. Autogenic succession is brought by changes in the soil caused by organisms there, so it's automatically generated. Allogenic succession is basically caused by external influence and not by vegetation. So, for example, erosion, leaching, and deposition of silt and clays can change nutrient content and basically lead to allogenic succession. When we talked about different phases of succession in the theories of climax. So monoclimax or climatic climax theory says that everything has the same climax. Polyclimax theory says that there are more than one vegetation climax controlled by soil moisture, soil nutrients, topography, and all that. Climax pattern theory says that there are a variety of climaxes governed by species uh, population and responses of species to biotic and abiotic conditions, and the nature will change as the environment changes, but the central and most widespread community will can be decided as the climatic climax. Then we talked about community organization, where we basically talked about what are keystone species. So basically, keystone species are species that play a greater role than their numerical abundance. Then the numerically abundant species, both of these are dominant species. Then we talked about community dominance index and how what is the relationship between diversity and dominance. So as dominance index increases, diversity decreases, but this relationship is not very straightforward. However, the relationship between dominance and productivity, which is where dominance increases and productivity increases, is kind of more strong. Then we talked that dominance changes with surroundings. If we change the surroundings by, let's say, pumping in nitrogen or phosphorus into some lake, then that will lead to a change as like more algae can now develop and basically dominate the area. So there'll be a algal bloom that is following, and eventually that will die off, and the species diversity will return back to normal, right? Next, we talked about community stability, which is the ability of a community to defy change or rebound from change. There are three kinds of stability. Uh, Not three kinds. So basically, there are three kinds of stability. The first is a global stability, which is basically the community is globally and locally stable. because even if you move it in any one direction, it will come back to the same place. Then we have the second case where the community is in a locally stable place, and you, let's say, push it too much, it comes back to another locally stable place. So the community changes, but it's again stable. In the third case, what happens is if you push a community too much, then it uh, leads to a lot of extinctions and colonizations, and the community changes fully. Then people say that diversity increases stability. So does diversity increase stability? So one argument in favor of that can be pest outbreaks occur more often on cultivated land, and cultivated land has less diversity. The counter argument is that no coevolutionary history with the pest. There is no coevolutionary history with the pests that reside there. Hey, similarly, if you say that tropical rainforests have fewer pest outbreaks than temperate forests, the counter argument is that tropical forests have not been studied enough. So there's no direct, like, no one has like basically proved the first said something about it, but there's no direct relationship between diversity and stability. But several experiments have suggested that very simple systems are inherently unstable. So there needs to be slightly more biodiversity for it to be stable. How does a system respond to instability? We are talking about community stability now. So resistance is basically a measure of uh, how much your system is resisting. So how much is it changing in response to the external pressures? And inertia is basically ability of the living system to resist external fluctuations. Now, resilience is a tendency of a system to retain its function and organization after a disturbance. So, measured in terms of elasticity and amplitude, elasticity is basically speed with which it returns to the original state. Amplitude is how far it was disturbed. So, this depth is amplitude, and this thing is elasticity. Right. And we talked about a case study in Lake Washington where they put basically they were putting sewage and they stopped it, and how the community changed, and because it was resilient, how it survived. Right. Then we talked about distribution and abundance of organisms, where we talked about biogeography. Mm. So biogeography is the study of geographical distribution of life on Earth and reasons for the patterns that are observed. Range is basically the distribution or the range boundaries of uh, geographical boundaries of a species distribution. Right. We talked about different kinds of habitats such as alpine meadows and where they're found, alpine forests and where they're found, then moist deciduous forest and dry deciduous forest. What are the different characteristics of these and where they're found in India? Some examples. We talked about the Run of Kutch, which is home to wildlasses. It has the Indian Wildlife Sanctuary because these wildlasses are more adapted to stay here in these areas, which is dry in the dry season and inundated in the monsoon, whereas the predators are not adapted to this, so there are less predators here. Right. There's a very high salinity, and basically there are a lot of migratory birds that are coming in, especially flamingos, for their breeding grounds. Then we talked about Chilika Lagoon, where basically there's a mix of fresh and sea salt water. There's a gradient, and there's shallow water. So there's photosynthetically active radiation that is going down to the bottom, and a large population of fishes and fish predators such as Irrawaddy dolphins and piscivorous birds. We talked about the Brahmaputra floodplains, which has a equitable climate and basically grass dominated due to annual floods, because trees cannot grow because it gets flooded every year. We talked about the Shola forest, which is basically these grassland and forest patches that are found in the Western Ghats on top of the hills, on top of the mountains, mountain ranges. Right. There's rich biodiversity because there's both grasses and trees that are found here. We talked about equatorial forests that are found in like basically Andamans and mangroves, which are found in like marshy areas. These mangroves are these pneumatophores, which are roots that are coming upwards to get air. Yeah. So biogeography, where a species found and why. So due to abiotic factors such as soil, climatic, and other things, and biotic factors such as availability of prey, predators, etc. Adaptations that uh, and based on the adaptations that a species might need to live in a given area, we can say that species are found in different areas. So species need certain conducive factor irrespective of altitude or latitude. So even if you are at a latitude of 2000 meters, you can, if you are there in like very low latitudes, you can still have a subtropical forest in that area, right? But if you go to higher latitudes, you will have a cool temperate or active forest, right? So basically, what is needed is the temperature. What is more important is the temperature, humidity, and other factors. And we talked about distribution of different snow leopards and basically coral reefs and how they relate. Basically, this is distribution of coral reefs with relation to the minimum and maximum sea temperature, surface temperature. If it's too hot, you see that. So if it's too cold, you see that there are not a lot of corals around. But if it's slightly in this range, right, then you see a lot more corals. The next question we ask is why are things where they are? So basically, what species are found where, why there, why are they found there, why are they not found in other places, and so on. So we talked about pull factors and push factors. Pull factors are factors that attract organisms to an area. Push factors are factors that drive organisms from an area. We talked about vegetation on slopes. We talked about dispersal and anthropogenic factors such as man-made factors, clearing of forest pollution, and so on. Uh, yeah, basically, mm, animals are found here, but not here. Why? Because we cut down this forest to make a road, right? Then we talked about habitat selection. Habitat selection is basically the uh, process of hierarchical process of behavioral responses that may result in disproportionate use of habitats to influence survival and fitness of individuals. So basically, a bird or organism or animal is looking for a what we say, specific habitat or preferring to use a specific habitat that is known as habitat selection. Right. So people showed that they're both innate and learned components because these sparrows, when they were not given any exposure to any foliage, they most of the times chose pine. But if they were given exposure to oak, then they were choosing oak. So basically, they can learn this. So if they're given exposure, they can learn. But even if there is no exposure, there's still a clear preference. Right. Then we talked about transplant experiments. So if something is found here, why is it not found in this larger area? What you can do is you can transport it. And let's say if it grows in this area, you see that what is the problem is that there might be other things such as the species has not yet come here, or maybe there's some natural predator here which it's trying to avoid and so on. Whereas if the species, if the plant or species is not able to grow here, what it means is that it's not, this place is not conducive for growth. Right. Yeah. Then we talked about Liebig's law of the minimum. So basically, the rate of any biological process is limited by the factor in least amount relative to the requirement. So there's only one limiting factor, and it's always only one limiting factor. Okay. Then we talked about Shelford's law of tolerance, where basically the geographical distribution of species will be controlled by the environmental factor for which the organism has the narrowest range of tolerance. So, for example, if you have a very high range of tolerance of temperature and pH, but very low tolerance of salinity, your distribution will depend on the range of salinity that you can survive in. And if the salinity of the whole world is somewhere in between, then this does not matter. The next thing would matter, which is the pH. So due to global warming, what is happening is basically there's shifts in range. People, animals and birds are moving upwards on mountains because it's getting hotter and hotter. For example, people found that the median altitude for malaria is increasing with temperature because mosquitoes are getting found more and more on the upper reaches, right? Upper areas. We talked about migration, which is the regular seasonal movement of animals, often along fixed routes, mm, to find better resources and shift from harsh to amiable climate. Then we talked about what are the different modes of dispersal. Diffusion is basically gradual movement over several generations. Chump dispersal is when basically you travel over large distances, often across unsuitable terrain. For example, uh, dispersal of rats on ships. Then secular dispersal is diffusion through evolutionary time. Migrants are divergent from the original population. For example, dispersal of humans out of Africa. We talked about allelopathy, how basically some plants secrete things that basically prevent growth of other plants, some uh, microbes, and basically this penicillin also prevents growth of bacteria and so on. Uh, yeah. Then we looked at some pull factors in greater detail. For example, how predators determine the distribution of the prey. For example, in this case, the sea urchin determines the distribution of the algae in a given lake. Removal of sea urchin leads to recolonization of the algae. Then we also see that predator governs the distribution and abundance of prey. If it fulfills four criteria, the organism does not survive when transplanted to the site where it does not normally occur. There's an inverse correlation between the distribution of organisms and suspected predator. The suspected predator is able to inflict lethal damage on the prey, and there's direct evidence that a suspected predator is responsible for destruction of the prey in transplantation experiments. If these four criteria are matching, then basically you can say that the predator is governing the abundance and distribution of the prey. But in some cases, the prey also governs the distribution and abundance of predator. For example, this unique um, sterile that is found in um, some plant is the stems of some plant is basically uh, determining where these fruit flies, Drosophila passia, can is found. Because it needs that specific uh, compound to complete its life cycle. Yeah, then again, basically, we can make use of these learnings that we have to basically control things, such as controlling pine rust by removing gooseberries, because these uh, organisms that are creating and that are leading to these diseases need both of these trees to complete their life cycle. So if you isolate the tree, then if only one kind of the tree is present, they won't be able to do it. Right. Then interspecific competition also governs distribution. So if there is, so you can see here that initially there's all of these are Indian territories, but once the tricolor blackbird come in, then basically they dominate this area and throw out the red-winged birds. Right. Then we talked about allelopathy, how experimentally we can demonstrate that. Basically, here is your control. Your apple seeds are growing properly. This your water is dripping from your grass. The seedling is not growing properly. Here, water is dripping from soil. So this is a negative control. So you want to see if like soil is doing anything, right? This is a positive control. So soil is doing anything or not, you want to see. So you see that here nothing is happening, here nothing is happening. The only thing that's happening is here where your plants are not growing. So you say that it is because of the grass. The grass is secreting something, right? Uh, this thing also basically happens for inter and intra species. So these peach plants often inhibit growth of peach plants near themselves. Right. So if you have peach following an apple, then you will have bear more fruit than following a peach in a plantation. Right. Then these Grevilla robusta kill their own seedlings because of allopathy. Yeah. Then, yeah, we talked about how temperature tolerance varies with acclimation temperature and how different, basically, uh, representative population of the same thing can basically adapt to different areas, right? Then, yeah, basically we talked about how felines are governed by many of these factors and so on. So that was it till week 7. Uh, Next Friday, which is 18th, we will meet once more and we will finish off the rest of it. I think there should be an announcement, but even if there's no announcement, please do attend the last class on Friday. If you have any doubts or any questions, please feel free to ask. If not, we can stop here. So yeah, on Friday, we'll see if we have time. We'll also try to discuss some questions, like assignment questions or some sample questions before your exams. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. Then we'll stop here. We'll meet on Friday, one last time on 18th, same time, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Okay. Thank you for attending. I'll see you next class. Bye.